So let me begin, yeah?
No, I'm not going to go there.
Okay, yeah.
No,
Okay.
no. Ladies and gentlemen, I won't be here very long. I'd like to welcome you to the Center for Persian Studies. Our lecture today is co-sponsored by the Classics Department, so I'd like to thank the Classics Department for joining us, and they're great collaborators. It is really my honor to introduce my colleague who's going to introduce Professor Rollinger, Professor Carlo Ceretti, our new Zoroastrian chair who has come from Rome to us. So Professor Ceretti, would you do
that? Can you manage it?
Yeah, somehow.
It's it's an obstacle. This is.
Yeah. So thank you to Raj and thank you Jordan Center for having us here. First of all, it is a pleasure for me to introduce Professor Robert Rollinger, who is one of the most accomplished ancient historians in Europe and around the world. And not only is he an ancient historian, but he's also an ancient historian who has always had a very special interest for Oriental history, ancient Oriental history. And basically he starts off his careers by working on Herodotus, by working on the relations between Greek sources and Assyriology and so on, and then has become, with time, one of the major specialists of the history of the Achaemenid Empire, and not only. He's a full professor at the University of Innsbruck, a full member of the Austrian Academy of Sciences in Vienna, has held a number of positions teaching around the world in Helsinki, in Hildesheim in Germany, at the Aga Khan University in London, and so on. But coming to things that are closer to California, since 2019 he is a Getty Scholar at the Getty Research Center in Los Angeles, which has tied him to California, and since 2020 he also holds the NAWA chair at the University of Wroclaw, where he leads a project on the period, the time span from the Achaemenid Empire to Roman rules. I will not list all the series and publication for which he is responsible, but just two names among the most prestigious in the field of classical studies: Orients and Occidents, published by Franz Steiner Verlag, and Classica et Orientalia, published by Harasowitz. To talk a little bit about his connection to UCI and to our center, together with Matthew Canepa and Turaj Daryai, he is the driving force behind the Pairavi conferences on ancient Iranian history. The most recent one, which was dedicated to the Sasanian Empire, was held in March 2023 and will soon be published, while always in 2023 the proceedings of a previous one on Iran and the transformation of ancient Near Eastern history, the Seleucids, that is from 312 to 150 BCE, was published, and the conference itself had been held at the UCI in 2020, if I remember well. He is also, together with Turaj and a number of other friends, the driving force behind a project, a very important project of collaboration that will deal with Pahlavi papyri in Vienna, and then sees together a very prestigious constellation of institutions, not only the Jordan Center, but also the University of Innsbruck, the Austrian National Library, and specifically the Papyrus Sammlung and the Austrian Academy of Science. So it is a project that we all very much look forward to. It would take 20 minutes, and I've taken already too much time to list even a part of Professor Rollinger's publications, but being an Italian, I would very much like to underline his ancient and profuse collaboration with Giovanni Lanfranchi from Padua, that resulted in a number of different, very important publications, one of which, at least the one that I have used most and have been most struck by, is Continuity of Empire, Assyria, Media, Persia, that was published in 2003 in Padua. But this is only one. There were different ones on the Assyrian Empire and so on. And just to mention one final publication that is very important in our context and relatively recent, together with Bruno Jacobs, Professor Rollinger published a companion to the Persian Achaemenid Empire, published by John Wiley and Sons in 2021 or 22, if I remember well. So thank you very much for coming, and please join me in welcoming Professor Rollinger. Now let's see if I get out of here without everything down.
Thank you so much, Carlo, for this very nice words, which I appreciate very much. Thank you to Raj for this very kind invitation. As you know, I really always like to come to Irvine. Irvine is a special place for me, has always been, and Carlo mentioned the many collaborations we have been developing, and it's really a joy being here, and it's a great opportunity. So what I'm going to introduce today is a paper I have been working for, I may say, for years, musing over a new conception of what we call the Persian Wars, and we may discuss after the talk some crucial guidelines. So let me just start. The Persian Wars are still regarded by many scholars and the general public as one of the major events in Western history. The instructive and captivating narrative of Herodotus' histories became a pillar of Greek historical consciousness, which, after some breaks, was transformed into a Western European culture of remembrance since the 19th century, the latest. Scholarly literature on this event is abundant and flourishing. The underlying subtext of a permanent confrontation between allegedly well-defined blocks of cultural identities, East and West, Europe and Asia, Orient and Occident, and their charged markers of liberty versus tyranny, democracy versus despotism, truthfulness versus shrewdness, luxury versus simplicity, bravery versus cowardness, and individualism versus collectivism have entered popular culture as well. Nevertheless, there have been plenty of innovative and inspiring approaches to the topic in the last years. Three aspects loom large in this respect. First, the interwovenness of Herodotus' histories with the very time of their production, that is, the political, social, and ideological circumstances of the first decade of the Peloponnesian War, and probably even beyond, so the 430s and 420s BC. Second, the deconstruction of the histories as a historical work in the modern sense, highlighting their literary dimension and Herodotus' creative force in storytelling. Third, beyond Detlef Fehling's radical criticism on Herodotus' sources, an ever-growing awareness of the frameworks and social settings of these sources, marked by oral tradition, cultural memory, identity, and lieu de mémoire. All three approaches have, or should have, substantial consequences for how we reconstruct the Persian Wars according to modern scholarly standards. Astonishingly, however, their impact is yet to be felt. This is not to deny that much ink has been spilled dealing with the multifarious historical problems and applying serious source criticism. But if we look at the results, one cannot avoid the conclusion that all modern histories of the Persian Wars are still more or less witty and erudite reproductions of Herodotus' histories. The basis of this approach is the stubborn conviction that Herodotus was able and willing to separate fact from fiction, and that his histories, grosso modo, actually report what essentially had happened. If we take into account the results modern scholarship produced concerning the different local traditions and productions of the events, the diverging and politically charged appropriations of the events, and the distortions and manipulations of oral traditions, one can only conclude that this would have been impossible even if Herodotus had wanted to achieve it. Historians generally do not like to hear this, but if the source they are dealing with is characterized by highly complex processes of emergence, then the most sophisticated methods of source criticism will only partially result in a satisfying historical reconstruction. Modern research with much better and much richer source situations provide telling lessons to be cautious indeed. Recent studies show how much narratives distort facts and construct peculiar traditions that are repeated over decades because they fit current ideologies. 3 examples will suffice to make the point. We have learned that personal memories and the mere fact of being a contemporary witness do not create reliable history. Bismarck's written memories are a good example for this, and they have now been successfully deconstructed for decades. The Battle of Dannenberg in 1914 has been reconstructed over decades just following the master narratives of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the 2 German generals, highlighting the strategic brilliance and superiority of the German forces over the Slavonic masses. Even the place of the battle was manipulated. It actually took place at Allenstein, but one was eager to construct a relationship to the famous Battle of the Teutonic Order in 1410. Finally, the famous Battle of Prokhorovka, part of the wider Battle of Kursk in July 1943, and celebrated as one of the largest tank battles in history, was not at all an overwhelming Soviet success as one could read in nearly all scholarly publications until some years ago, but a catastrophe for Soviet counterattackers. All these reversals and deconstructions of stories that had become history were only possible due to meticulous studies in archives and the careful evaluation of written archival sources and aerial photography. For the Persian Wars, we will probably never have such options, but we can nevertheless draw our conclusions from this. A distinctive master narrative, produced about 60 years after the events, cannot be a reliable basis for the reconstruction of what had happened. This does not, of course, mean that the Persian Wars are fictitious. Aeschylus' Perse, Simonides' poetry, the Burrow of Marathon, the Serpent Column, and other pre-Herodotean testimonies are unequivocal witnesses. We may also trust the rough sequence of events and battles as well as the final outcome. There was an Ionian revolt, a landing at Marathon, and 10 years later an army of the empire pushing forward as far as Athens, conquering the city, and after 2 military confrontations, retreating 1 year later. But details of the confrontations, the motives and goals of the main historical agents, the nature, course, and outcome of the battles should receive a more cautious treatment. To be sure, modern scholarship is not uncritical towards Herodotus' report, but beyond a uniform rejection of the number of soldiers the empire supposedly led on the field, there is no broad consensus on problematic details. This is not the place to write an alternative history of the Persian Wars. Such a venture is also challenging since there is no alternative voice. We do not know how the Achaemenid Persian kings and the elites of the empire assessed the events, since there is not a single inscription which mentions the wars. However, this does not mean that we are not able, at least roughly, to reconstruct the vision of the empire on the events. Methodologically, there are two ways to deal with this issue. On the one hand, we have plenty of information on the political and military machinery and the working mechanism of the Achaemenid Persian Empire and its ancient Eastern predecessors. Especially relevant are the relationship between empire and borderlands and the political mechanisms that arise from such a constellation. On the other hand, this imperial setting can be compared and confronted with information from Herodotus' histories. Such an endeavor should at least offer the possibility of recognizing pieces of information that fit into a broader scenario of imperial agency and local resistance. I will start with some truisms. First, the fact that there is no extant Achaemenid Persian inscription on the events is not to be misinterpreted as witness for a crushing defeat. With the exceptions of the famous Cyrus cylinder that deals with the conquest of Babylon and Darius' monumental Bisidun inscription that legitimizes his usurpation, Tezpid and Achaemenid kings did not transform their major military successes into laudatory texts. Be it Cyrus' most impressive campaign, that is his conquest of the Iranian East deep into Central Asia, his victories against Lydia, Cambyses' conquest of Egypt, or Darius' campaigns in India, Libya, and the Aegean, there are no reports, no praises, no laudatory hymns. Second, the wars and confrontations we are talking about were never Persian wars. This was at no time a confrontation between the Persians and the Greeks. In fact, it was a confrontation between an empire and its multi-ethnic army, including Greeks, and varying coalitions of Greek states under different leadership. The Achaemenid Persian Empire was neither Persian nor a national state, but a multi-ethnic and multilingual empire with a king and an imperial elite who defined themselves as Persian. The designation notwithstanding, this elite was more a social than an ethnic configuration. Third, the prehistory of the events can easily be harmonized with imperial strategies in general. The empire had a permanent agenda of conquest and expanse. This pursuit was related to the imperial claim to rule the world and the fluid borders of the empire, but also drawn from the principle of royal heroism and the great king's ambition to surpass any predecessor by military vigor and conquest. Along these lines, Western Asia Minor was conquered and imperial influence was expanded towards the central and northern Aegean until even Macedonia became a vassal of the empire. Fourth, we do not know exactly the motives and triggers for the Ionian revolt, but it was surely not a common desire for freedom from the imperial yoke. If this had been the case, then the sincere crisis after the death of Cambyses and the multiple uprisings all over the empire would have been the best opportunity to get rid of imperial oppression. But unlike the other regions of the empire, Western Asia Minor remained silent and quiet during this period. Moreover, important cities like Ephesus did not participate in the uprising, as there were different governments, factions in each polis, which is true for Asia Minor as well as for Cyprus. Therefore, the Ionian revolt was neither a national uprising nor a general fight for freedom. The motives must be sought elsewhere, and they can be best explained with the specific borderland situations in the West. Local elites in borderland areas face multiple situations which are as difficult as promising. They represent the nodal points of communications and actions towards the empire on the one hand, but also towards the world beyond on the other hand. Personal aspirations and ambitions find plenty of situations for dynamic development, but also bearing high risk and danger. Staying loyal to the empire while pursuing one's own agenda can be challenging. The point of no return, the fatal and final decision to fight with or against the empire, is often closer than expected. Such situations trigger dynamics that are neither under control of the local agents nor of the imperial agents, but they just unfold and proliferate. Aristagoras of Miletus gives a good examples for this kind of constellation. His decision to intervene in the affairs of Naxos and to launch an expedition against the island exhibit his ambitions and his position between empire and the outside world. The failure of his naval enterprise against Naxos launched a series of events whose ultimate reasons were as personal as they were local, but became later interpreted as national and political. Fifth, even before the Ionian revolt, the empire had expanded its influence towards the south of Macedonia as well as in the northern and central Aegean. This was a process and not a real act of coordinated conquest. The main agents were the satraps and local elites of the borderlands, who used the imperial backing to expand their influence and to please the king. Aristagoras was merely one of them. For the political entities facing the approach of the empire, this development offered possibilities, but also created threats. This was all the more true when a polity was already wrecked by factional strife. Thus, the appearance of the empire created new opportunities that could not be assessed by objective criteria, but by individual interest and ambition. It had a further dividing effect within the polities involved, since it stimulated discord and resentment. For ambitious politicians, however, there were plenty of new opportunities to strengthen and expand their individual standing within each polity. These dynamics immediately created factions that operated on behalf of or against the empire. But the goals they were visioning were primarily local and individual. Athens is an excellent example for these borderland dynamics when it moved into the orbit of the empire. After the expulsion of Hippias in 510, the city faced internal conflict and unrest. Spartan involvement was threatening again, and in this very situation, the presence of the empire created a completely new framework of political agency. The empire could not be ignored as well as Sparta. It is revealing that the Athenian decision makers opted for an agreement with the empire and did not play a national card, since such a card had yet to be invented. In this situation, the Athenians sent a delegation to Artaphernes, the Persian satrap, in Sardis, as Herodotus reports. According to the Greek historiographer, they agreed to conclude a symmachia, that's the Greek term he uses, a binding agreement, and accepted to give, quote, earth and water as a sign of submission. We do not really know what exactly happened at the satrapal court and what the term symmachia implied in 507 and how the satrap interpreted the agreement. In any case, it is interesting to note that in Herodotus' own times, that is about 100 years later, there was still an awareness that at the beginning of the conflict, conflict, Athens had set the first step and tried to get to terms with the empire. It is conceivable that the Athenians were simply striving for imperial backing by offering gifts and demonstrating a cooperative spirit. However, in the eyes of the empire, such an act was seen as a sign of submission. Athens had become a part of the empire, although the Athenians did neither intend nor completely realize this new development. This is a characteristic borderland situation with different understandings of a complex situation. Such a double vision could be tacitly accepted by both parties, as bilingual inscriptions of local rulers in borderland areas exhibit that use different terminologies in characterizing new political situations. In any case, with the establishment of a new political order in Athens and the appearance of new decision makers within the next years, the situation changed again. This also implied a re-evaluation of the relationship towards the empire, as Athens' assistance of the Ionian revolt demonstrates. For the empire, this was a harsh act of disobedience and insubordination that could not be accepted by principle. Maybe the Athenian decision makers were not really aware of the consequences of their political engagement, or perhaps the annually alternating polis regime changed its politics. In any case, events took their course. Sixth, the evaluation criteria of modern scholarship simply reproduce the assessment of our Greek sources. This not only becomes evident in the source situations we encountered, but also when we confront modern assessments of the Persian Wars, with the imperial army as invader and the Greek alliance as defenders, with later military encounters with Greek invaders and the empire as defender. Whereas Xerxes' retreat to his homeland after the successful conquest of Athens is generally seen as an act of desperation of a cowardly Oriental king who already suspects the menacing failure of the whole campaign, the retreat to the Black Sea of Xenophon's 10,000 after their crushing defeat at the Battle of Cunaxa in 501 is celebrated as a heroic feat celebrating Greek military bravery and resilience. The same difference becomes apparent if we compare the common assessments of the Battle of Marathon with the battle at the river Eurymedon. At Marathon, the landing of imperial troops is characterized as total failure, verified by their retreat and embarking after the confrontation. At Eurymedon, the landing of a Greek military contingent is celebrated as a huge victory that even became greater since the Greeks were successfully able to re-embark and sail forth from the location. But we may leave this nitpicking aside and concentrate now on some main events of the confrontation. As far as Marathon is concerned, we do not really know what the operation intended. Was it a raid or an invasion? What we can say for sure is that there was a landing operation and a subsequent military engagement followed by a re-embarking. If this was just a raid, then the enterprise might even have been regarded as a success, especially since Eretria had previously been sacked and the empire had gained a foothold in the central Aegean. If it was an invasion, then it was an obvious failure. In any case, we should not forget to take into account the possible different viewpoints of such an event. For the defenders, anything else than absolute defeat could be sold as success, victory, and triumph. For the invaders, it was just vice versa. Anything else than absolute victory meant retreat. And any retreat was seen by the defenders as ignominious withdrawal of the invaders. However, battles more than once used to end without a definite victor. Victory and success are not absolute qualifications, but depend on assessment, viewpoint, and development post festum. For Athens, the re-embarking of the imperial troops was a triumph, and it was used as a propaganda to to highlight the city's standing within the Greek world. The celebration of this victory in the famous Dua Poikile, here you can a reconstruction, at the Athenian Agora demonstrates how Chiemont and Athenian decision makers interpreted and marketed the event. This was the decisive moment of building tradition, not the event as such. It's important. The same principles hold true for Xerxes' attack 10 years later, just referring to Hilmar Klinkert's fantastic book. This attack, however, was an entirely different nature than the one 10 years earlier. Although the empire may have regarded the confrontation with Athens as still unsettled, since the city had not yet been called to account, which was perceived a serious problem for the empire's prestige, this can hardly be the line of reasoning behind the campaign. It is far more reasonable that the new king Xerxes might have seen a welcome opportunity to launch a successful campaign into territories no Achaemenid Persian king had entered before, and thus celebrating his bravery and heroism. But this campaign was not just a campaign, as we have seen in the last 400 years since the establishment of empire in the ancient Near East. There is no real comparison for this, and it was the most massive military undertaking the world has seen so far. Although there might have been tendencies to establish a fleet in Neo-Babylonian times, ancient Near Eastern empires were monarchies with powerful land forces. This changed with the establishment of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. First steps towards building up an imperial fleet may already have been made in the time of Cambyses, when he campaigned against Egypt. But the decisive developments took place during the reigns of Darius I and Xerxes. With the latter, the Achaemenid Persian Empire became the first empire in world history whose naval forces were matching its land forces. This ambitious goal was achieved by drawing on the competences and knowledge of those vassals and subjects who had centuries-long experiences in these matters. These were mainly the subjects along the Levantine and Aegean coasts, but the Cypriots too contributed to this endeavor. For a successful campaign towards the west of the Aegean, such a navy was a necessary prerequisite. Never before in the history of the ancient Near East, a campaign was launched so far from the imperial center. So I just give you some numbers. So if we take Shiraz, which is about 60 kilometers from Persepolis as a starting point, it is about 2,100 kilometers to Kabul, Bactria, 2,600 kilometers to Islamabad, Indus, and via Istanbul and Thessaloniki about 3,900 kilometers to Athens. Nota bene, from New York City to Los Angeles, it is about 4,000 kilometers. So just to see the dimensions, you know. The supply lines were extraordinarily long and complicated, since the campaign was launched beyond the sea. Without an already established firm grip on Western Asia Minor and the North Aegean, such a campaign would not have been possible at all. Macedonia, as assisting vassal, was also an important precondition. It is no surprise that such an undertaking needed years of preparations. The logistic challenges were enormous and not comparable to any campaign that had been launched before. Actually, Xerxes' campaign was the first combined land and sea offensive in world history. This alone demonstrates how important such a venture was for the Achaemenid king. But this alone does not reveal anything about the actual goals. At first glance, one may argue that such a massive effort is only explainable if the intention was total submission, annexation, and provincialization. But this is not necessarily the case. If the prestige of the empire and its king required a harsh punishment of Athens, then every effort was justified to reach this goal. The same holds true for the aggrandizement of the great king's fame and his ability to surpass all his predecessors, even his father Darius. Of course, this would have implied submission and vassalage of Athens, but not necessarily provincialization. As the later history of the empire demonstrates, Vassalage was a well-accepted means to guarantee and maintain imperial superiority. Such a policy would have been completely in the vein with the preceding ancient Eastern empires. The march of the army from the center of the imperial periphery, where the campaign actually started, was already a celebration of royal grandeur and prowess. This also included technological feats such as the ship bridge across the Hellespont that created unbelieving astonishment. The parade at Doriscus immediately before the movement towards enemy country is a well-attested tradition of ancient Eastern campaigning. What follows is described in much detail by Herodotus. But it is these details and their viewpoint which should raise doubts. The king leading the army by himself was not an extraordinary case. Many Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian kings used to lead their campaigns in person. The same holds true for Cyrus, Cambyses, and Darius. So it was simply a traditional task Xerxes carried out, but it once more testified to the importance of the venture. Apart from its eminence in tradition, the encounter at Thermopylae did not play any role at all. If there is historicity in Herodotus' account, then it was an entirely absurd and pointless endeavor. That Hermann Göring tried to make use of it in the final days of the Battle of Stalingrad in 1943 just highlights this absurdity. Apparently, there was no serious resistance, as there were probably more Greeks fighting with the great king than against him. The conquest and plundering of Athens was a great success and adequately celebrated. Xerxes installed a new police regime and ordered sacrifices to the still extant cult images on the Acropolis in Athens. In contrast to the shrines, these images had not been destroyed. It is by no means far-fetched to see this general event as the actual goal of the campaign. If Xerxes might have thought mission accomplished and felt deep contentment, this was attractive for the moment, but nevertheless a complete miscalculation, as it should evolve time and again in later history. We remember what it means, mission accomplished. Such a miscalculation was the case for at least two reasons. On the one hand, the enemy was not yet defeated, since so far no major encounter had taken place. And we remember, only an absolute defeat of the allied Greek alliance, led by the Lacedaemonians, would have transformed the campaign into an ultimate success. The retreat of the alliance and the avoidance of a direct confrontation with the superior forces of the empire was a brilliant strategy for which Athens had to pay a high price. The great king might have been surprised that the burning of Athens did not immediately imply the enemy's surrender and his acceptance of imperial superiority. But this was the case. And apart from pride over the achievements, uneasiness over the final outcome might have begun to rise. On the other hand, the alliance had every strategic advantage on its side. The longer the empire could not bring about a final decision, the higher the chance of success for the alliance, which had the huge advantage of interior lines. The long supply routes were a serious problem for the attackers that became more problematic the longer the campaign lasted. It was therefore the empire which was striving for a decisive blow and not the defenders. What exactly happened at Salamis, as well as Plataea, we will never know. Crucial for both confrontations was the result, not the event as such. The empire was not able to utterly subdue the enemy forces. What we see are the first signs of an imperial overstretch that brought the empire in a more and more difficult situation. Anyhow, Salamis cannot have been a complete defeat, otherwise the supply of the army would have been crushed and the campaign would have ended immediately in a catastrophe. The fact that the imperial army stayed in Hellas for one more year is as remarkable as the imperial incapacity to overcome the enemy. If we believe Herodotus' narrative, this was the moment when the great king left the scene and passed the command to his generals. Although this decision is at first glance not as extraordinary as it seems, but it nevertheless deserves closer inspection. If the great king ever had intended to establish direct rule in these territories, he now gave up his plans. As shown by the example of Cambyses, who stayed 3 years in Egypt, it took some time for the king to arrange such affairs. Of course, he could still have felt satisfied to have shown insubordinate Athens the long arm of imperial power, but he may also have started to realize that his campaign triggered developments he could not really control anymore. Seen through the eyes of the alliance, the encounter of Salamis, but also the great king's withdrawal, was as great as a surprising success. But the imperial army remained. The mere fact that the imperial army was able to stay in the field over winter is remarkable. Actually, this is the first case in the history of ancient Eastern empires where a campaign did not end with the close of the campaigning season and the imperial army did not retreat to its base. This alone demonstrates the still unbroken power of the imperial army and the organizational capacity of the empire. There were no problems with the Greek vassals, as the empire was still willing and confident to strike a final blow on the enemy, as the second burning of Athens 1 year later demonstrates. But this enemy was much more resistant than expected. The burning of Athens did not bring the desired result of vassalage and submission, and this alone was a serious problem. For Plataea, the same applies as for Salamis. What counted was not the battle as such, but the result. The imperial army was not able to defeat the enemy, and this fact alone had to retreat as its unavoidable consequence. We may doubt what Herodotus tells us in all details about the battle as such, as we may doubt whether Mardonius really lost his life on the field. But the result was unequivocal. So why do we have to doubt this way? It's Mardonius, because there's a cuneiform document from Babylon 2 years after the battle where we still have a Mardonius and his land holdings. So, but the result was unequivocal. The gigantic efforts notwithstanding, the imperial army had to withdraw without achieving any submission or surrender. From this viewpoint, the campaign was a major failure, and it triggered problems and unrest in the western borderlands the empire had to tackle with for the next decades. But it was neither a catastrophe nor a turning point in history. Only from the viewpoint of the defenders, this was a moment of unseen triumph and victory. But the alliance broke shortly after the imperial army retreated and gave way to a new conflict which engaged these borderlands for the next 100 years. It was only solved when, with the empire's crucial assistance, the rising star of the Athenian naval power was crushed by imperial finances and Spartan engagement. At the very same time, the expelled victor of Salamis, Themistocles, received a new homestead from the Achaemenid Persian king. This was an estate around Magnesia on the Meander River, including several locations in Mysia that guaranteed an appropriate lifestyle and a kind of official position. It was no problem at all that Themistocles and his son Archeptolis issued silver coinage in their name as long as they remained loyal to the great king. This, as a rule, was the guiding principle of Achaemenid Persian political practice. Vassals of this kind were a common feature of rule in Asia Minor, Cyprus, and beyond. If there were problems, the great king successfully intervened with the help of other vassals and the watchful eyes of the satraps. With the defeat of Athens at the end of the Peloponnesian War, the great kings skillfully made use of Greek strife and discord. The Spartans were only able to uphold their short-lived hegemony with the assistance of the great kings. This situation ended up with the king's peace in 387-86 BC, when the empire controlled again nearly all regions that had been under its command since Xerxes had launched his campaign. The empire had a long shadow and became de facto hegemon of the Aegean world. Within this framework, Greek discourse had developed enthusiastically the idea of freedom and autonomy. This vision was originally directed towards the aspirations of Athens and Sparta, but it was now turned against the Achaemenid Persian Empire that represented Asia. The work of Isocrates is a living witness for such a development. However, this was not part of a national movement, but a concept that could be instrumentalized politically at the right moment against any threatening imperial and pseudo-imperial formation. It was also addressed towards the rising new power of Macedonia. Voices in Athens and beyond were divided whether this new kingdom was part of the Greek world or a threatening opponent. The great kings appear to have seen rather relaxed this evolving new kingdom. It was part of the never-ending dynamics of the borderlands and had adapted characteristic imperial structures and principles for quite a long time. The great kings might at first hand not have seen any differences as compared to developments in Western Asia Minor, where powerful kings like the Hectamonids appeared and demonstrated their strength and ambition through magnificent monuments. At the very same time, these dynasts developed new forms of cultural expressions that combined Western and imperial elements in an innovative way. This is the birthplace of what modern scholarship generally describes as Hellenistic culture. It did not evolve with Alexander III, but before, had a clear Achaemenid Persian imperial imprint, and is the characteristic outcome of a dynamic borderland process. However, these dynamics in the Western borderlands triggered uncontrolled developments that finally led to the empire's downfall. As the Neo-Babylonian Empire, about 200 years before, was struck down by a political entity that emerged and prospered in a borderland context, this was also the case with the Achaemenid Persian Empire, with the only difference that the opponent this time arose in the West. But the details of this upcoming confrontation differed considerably. Whereas Cyrus only needed one short campaign to bring down the Neo-Babylonian Empire within a few weeks, Alexander III had to fight for years to overcome harsh resistance. From a military point of view, Alexander completed what the Achaemenid Persian Empire had begun. As we have seen, the Achaemenid Persian army was the first one to continue a campaign over more than a year. Alexander spent many years in the enemy's country, and this is remarkable as such. And the distances Alexander and his various armies covered once more expanded to, just counting a line from Athens to Islamabad, about 6,500 kilometers. Again, however, this was only possible due to a perfect and splendidly established infrastructure with an outstanding system of stations and roads that was a welcome tool to be used by the invader. And there is another point to be mentioned. Even with the death of Darius III, resistance did not end. Alexander's final success was only possible due to an alliance with the still extant Iranian elites and the integration of imperial contingents into a newly established army. This implied a reconfiguration of rule and an orientation towards already extant models of monarchic legitimization. From this perspective, Pierre Briand hit the point when he described Alexander III as the last Achaemenid. But there was change and transformation, of course, the most important of which was that a new mixed elite emerged and that the former elites from Persis did not play a dominant role anymore. The process now evolving somehow resembled to the transformations that took place when the Arabs brought down the Sasanian Empire. James Howard Johnson, the grand seigneur of late antique history, denied that the Arabs really conquered Sasanian Iran, but asserted that, I quote him, they inserted themselves into a huge upland territory with a distinctive character, end of quote, with the former empire maintaining its identities, political visions, and trans-regional cultural consciousness. This is an ingenious description of what happened at the end of the 4th century BCE and initiated a process of transformation that was much more complex than the term Hellenism betrays. Alexander III only induced this process that fully evolved in Seleucid times. History spared the young and dynamic Macedonian king to demonstrate that he was able to maintain and hold together what his Achaemenid Persian predecessors ruled successfully for about 200 years. Thank you for your attention.